Scripture reading this morning is a short passage from 1 Samuel 22. And if you'll take your bulletin, we'll read this in unison together and attempt to read it as a congregation. Beginning in verse 1. David departed from there and escaped to the cave Adullam. And when his brothers and all his father's house heard of it, they went down there to him. And everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was bitter in soul gathered to him. And he became captain over them. And there were with him about 400 men. And David went from there to Mizpah of Moab, and he said to the king of Moab, "Please let my father and my mother stay with you till I know what God will do for me." And he left them with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. Then the prophet Gad said to David, "Do not remain in the stronghold. Depart and go into the land of Judah." So David departed and went into the forest of Hereth. Now Saul heard that David was discovered and the men who were with him. Saul was sitting at Gibeah under the tamarisk tree on the height with his spear in his hand, and all his servants were standing with him. And Saul said to his servants who stood about him, "Hear now, you people of Benjamin, will the son of Jesse give you, every one of you, fields and vineyards? Will he make you commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds, that all of you have conspired against me? No one discloses to me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. None of you is sorry for me or discloses to me what my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait as at this day." Then answered Doeg the Edomite, who stood by the servants of Saul, "I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Ahimelech the son of Ahitub, and he inquired of the Lord for him, and gave him provisions, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine." The Lord bless our reading to our understanding, and you may be seated. The title for this morning's sermon is Crushed Expectations, but Still Trusting in God. We've been tracking David's life over the last few months, looking at where he traveled and how he rose from being a shepherd to be the servant of Saul, and then coming under suspicion and fleeing away. So many would have said that when David was anointed by Samuel, he was chosen and most blessed to be king of Israel. Surely God is with him, or was with him, and will prosper him in all that he does. He was taken even though he was the youngest of the sons of Jesse of Bethlehem. The youngest son is least likely to inherit well. He was given a servant's job of looking after the sheep. But God sent Samuel, and he was chosen and honored over his brothers to be king of Israel. And in a short time, we've seen that God began to prepare him for his future kingship. Saul called him to come and play the lyre to comfort him. And then he became a commander of 1,000, a leader and respected military commander. And God gave him great victory over Goliath, and repeated success greater than the other commanders of Saul. He was so successful that Saul became jealous. And he eyed his every move to see if he had intentions on rising up against Saul to rule the kingdom. From David's perspective, he now seems to have everything. He even is married to the daughter of the king, and then suddenly everything falls apart. Saul grows jealous. 3 times he tries to kill him with his spear. And Saul then commands his inner circle of servants and leaders to kill David. And all this without any evidence to warrant putting him to death. I got a chance to talk to one of my nephews during my time in Cortland, New York, at our family gathering. We had about 50 people. It was exciting to see so many aunts and uncles and nieces and nephews and brothers and sisters all gathered in the first time in a very long time. This nephew, he shared with me that things had not gone so very good for him, at least not as he had hoped it would go after he graduated from high school. He tried college, and that did not work out. I didn't get all the details of it, but I can imagine what happened. So he joined the Marines, thinking that would be a better choice. And during his basic training, his thumb was injured, and then they processed, as the military often does, they processed him out with disability. But still, it was another dead end. For most of us, I think things happen in our lives that are not part of our plan for our lives. We start out believing that God is leading us, and then things begin to fall apart. Then doubt begins to set in, and we wonder, what is God doing? Has God been leading me at all? We ask, why did he allow the bad things to happen and come into our lives? Or if we weren't following him in the first place and we were on our own out there doing our own thing, then we tend to blame God for our troubles. For my nephew, he stopped following the Lord for a while and began to choose things. He grew up in the church, but he chose things he knew the Lord did not approve of. And we call it backsliding. In his own testimony, he says that he really didn't know the Lord, even though he was in a church that taught the gospel. I talked to his father, too, at the reunion, my brother-in-law, and he told me that he was never so happy as when his son repented and turned back to the Lord to choose to follow him and to seek his will for whatever is next in his life. This nephew is now helping and with an outreach to other young people through a youth program in one of the local churches there in Cortland. He's helping, and he himself is getting help and teaching from his pastor. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 3 and 4, Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." For many people, it seems to be necessary for them to hit bottom before they feel the need to reach out and call upon the Lord for help. We have this independent spirit in us that depends on ourselves and depends on our own resources. And at last resort, we say, "Lord, help me." We wander. And then we get hardened in our heart, unwilling to admit that we were sinning or we had made bad choices without consulting him or putting him first in our lives. But this verse says, the poor in spirit recognize that only God can take the broken, sinful lives and lead us step by step into something good for His will for us. It requires humility and submission to find the will of God. My own life was not very different. When I was 20, I flunked out of college, ornamental horticulture. I wanted, or at least I thought I wanted, to be a landscape architect. But I had no time for God, no time for church or anything religious. I was too busy with college. It was not very long before my life was a mess of bad choices. I ended up flunking out, joining the Army during the Vietnam era, and was very, very far from Christian influence. But the Lord, in His mercy, sought me out. He revealed Himself to me through a series of events and an invitation to a Bible study and a book that I read that studied scriptures of the Old Testament, much like we read this morning, where Jesus explained to them the verses in the Old Testament about Himself. And I was astounded. How could God had revealed over thousands of years details of the life of His coming Messiah, His Son. There is surely a God, and He surely has sent His Son into this world. Lord, in His mercy, had sought me out and revealed Himself to me, and He put me in a place where I received help from those leading a Christian ministry with young soldiers at Fort Knox, Kentucky. God is merciful. In Psalm 34, 14-19, David says that he learned this from his own experience of falling on hard times. This is what he says about his own life. Turn away from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. The eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous, and He hears their cry. The face of the Lord is against those who do evil, to cut off the memory of them from the earth. When the righteous cry for help, the Lord hears and delivers them out of all their troubles. The Lord is near the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers them out of them all. We'd have a false view that if you come to Jesus, everything's going to be wonderful. That's never been the promise. Not at any time at all. He promises that there will be hard times, and there may even be afflictions and great troubles. David did not cease to strive to do good, even when others were doing bad things to him. He seeks the Lord and whatever help he can find. So where did he search for help? He went to Samuel. And then he went to the priests at Nob. And each helped them either with counsel or with whatever they had at hand, with bread and with the sword of Goliath. He counseled with Jonathan, not wanting to lose his friendship, and he sought for peace with Saul and a safe place of refuge. So he went down to Gath once he knew Saul was determined to kill him, thinking he could find refuge there, only to find that he found himself in greater danger. He then sought out a solitary place to hide. And that brings us to the passage for today. 1 Samuel 22, 1 and 2. David departed from there, and I've added there, meaning Gath and the Philistines, and he escaped to the cave of Adullam. Now, if you go to the next slide there, I forgot my pen light, so you're going to have to help me, Brian. Adullam, if you find Gath, can you see Gath on the map? Go to your left and over there you go. That's Gath. Now come straight down until you're just east of the coastal plain. Just go to the right. Right there. That's about the region where the cave of Adullam is. It's located in the foothills between the coastal plain and the hill country, 20 kilometers southwest of Bethlehem and 16 kilometers southeast of Gath. David fled out to the edge of the territory between the Philistines and Judah to a region known for its caves. And he's hiding alone in a cave in the village, near the village of Adullam. But his presence did not remain hidden. And when his brothers and all his father's house heard of it, they went down there to him. And everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, and everyone who bitter in soul gathered to him. And he became captain over them. And they were with him about 400 men. You know, this is a really interesting series of verses where it says everyone. I mean, it sounds like the news spread throughout the entire region of Israel. David's hiding. Oops, he's down there at Adullam. It's not hidden at all. Everyone seems to know where he is, and anybody with any kind of personal trouble and trauma are gathered to him. There were about 400 people, 400 men who fled to be with David. They didn't flee to Saul looking for justice. They fled to David, who's a refugee. They themselves were being pursued. Sutumura, who wrote the New International Commentary on 1 Samuel, suggests that the news of David's hiding place must have spread far and wide, since 400 other dissident men came to join David in hiding. They were also in distress, in debt, and bitter of soul. This indicates that they also have had hard times. The phrase, every man in straits, refers to every man in a hard-pressed situation. Hard times had fallen on them, and they were likely pursued by money lenders or had some kind of trouble where someone sought vengeance against them. In the ancient times, a person could possibly pay his debt. If he couldn't pay his debt, they would have their property confiscated. Not only that, if they were in debt, they could be sold into slavery. Bitterness often comes on a person when bad times come and they blame someone else for their troubles. The phrase is used for people like Hannah, who was persecuted by her rival. She was in bitter distress. The men of Ziklag were in bitter distress when their families were taken captive and Ziklag was burned. And the homeless Danites were in distress because they had not yet found their home, their dwelling place. David and his followers fleeing from Absalom, who had led the rebellion to replace his father as king, they were also in bitter distress, fleeing Jerusalem. Thus, David becomes the leader of everyone who has suffered some kind of loss or deprivation or discontented or disenchanted, mistreated by society. Therefore, they were passionate for change, and they were willing to share in David's fate and do anything that David commanded them to do. If I lay my thumb on this too long, it jumps and closes the document. I'm going to have to figure out why it's doing that. So that's the second time this morning it's happened. Many people have speculated that the arrival of his family at the cave indicates that they too have come into some kind of danger from Saul. Possibly Saul is seeking David's life. He went and visited his family in search of him. He would have come to Bethlehem seeking David and warned them that if they helped David, he would kill them as well. Sumura also wrote in the commentary, he said that the fact that David became captain over them indicates that God has drawn together others to rally around him. He's not alone anymore. They may have been dissidents, but he is now commander of a small fighting band. And this provides David with some level of security, some protection. If they're attacked, there's others to make a stand with him. 1 Samuel 22, 3 and 4 says, this level of protection and dwelling in a cave would not be very adequate for his elderly parents. It's camping out and it's rough living. And elderly don't do well in those kinds of situations. So David went from there to Mizpah in Moab, and he said to the king of Moab, please let my father and mother stay with you till I know what God will do for me. Till I know what God will do for me. He's seeking a safe place for his parents, and while he's still got trust in the Lord that God is going to resolve this whole situation. And he left his parents there with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. So you may remember that Jesse and David were descendants of Boaz and Ruth the Moabitess. They could claim some kind of kinship affinity with those in Moab. Maybe as a slim connection, but it's still a connection, and their ancestor was from there. And maybe finds a safe place of shelter. So David asked the king of Moab if his mother and his father can shelter there until he finds out what God will do for him. He's still trusting God, and he's to bring a peaceful resolution to his troubles. Trusting means waiting on God, continuing to call out to him and to rescue him from his trouble, to provide his promises to him that he will someday become king of Israel. It's not long after this that God sends a prophet, the prophet Gad, to David with a message. In 1 Samuel 22, 5, it says, then the prophet Gad said to David, do not remain in this stronghold. Depart, go into the land of Judah. So David departed and went into the forest of Hereth. When I hear that God is sending a prophet to David in hiding, it makes me smile. Reminds me that God is still looking after him. He knows where he is. He knows that David needs his direction to fulfilling his purpose for David. We're not quite sure why God would want David back in Judah. It's surely more dangerous, closer to Saul. It may be that the Lord still has something that he wants to do in both David and Saul's life by having them further encounters with each other. He may want to teach David about his faithfulness, his steadfastness. And he may want to test David to see if he will obey and trust him, even when it's not in the logic of our logic to want to be near to a dangerous person. We may not know where in Judah the forest of Hereth is, but because it is a forest and that's a relatively dry region, I would suggest that they took refuge in a wooded slope of a higher elevation, somewhere nearer to the western edge of Judah where there was more trees. It definitely was not in the wilderness of the eastern side, which is a very harsh desert. This whole time while Saul is fleeing, David is fleeing, Saul has continued to seek him and to seek out where David is hiding. And verse 6 says, now Saul heard that David was discovered. Someone had reported to him his location. And he also heard that there were many men with him. Saul was sitting at Gibeah under the tamarisk tree on the height with his spear in his hand and all his servants who were standing with him. And Saul said to his servants who stood about him, hear now, you people, Benjamin, the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards? Will he make you all commanders and thousands and commanders of hundreds, that all of you have conspired against me? No one discloses to me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. None of you is sorry for me or discloses to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait at this day. I don't know if you can hear in the conversation of Saul, but he stopped trusting God. He stopped trusting God soon after God rejected him as king. He's now suspicious of his own countrymen, that they're in league with David. And even his own son, he's suspicious of him of being in league with David. He has heard David now has a band of men, and he imagines things that David is lying in wait for him and to ambush him and kill him. And he blames Jonathan, falsely accusing him, stirring up David to conspire against him. These are the actions of a fearful heart who's departed from the walk of faith and trust in the Lord. There is there, though, at that time, Doeg the Edomite. And he hears what Saul is saying, and he says to Saul, I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, and he inquired of the Lord for him and gave him provisions and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. And you can imagine, as soon as Saul heard this, he assumes the worst. He assumes a new coalition has formed between David and the priests. He sees this growing rebellion against him as king. But then when he commands his servants, he calls the priests to come to him, and he commands his servants to put them to death. They refuse. But only Doeg the Edomite is willing to carry out his command. Poor Saul has gripped with fear, and now he's murdering the priesthood. This has a number of different consequences for Saul later as he continues. It will isolate Saul even further. The priests are the teachers and representatives of Yahweh in Israel. They are there to teach the people the law and to intercede for them when they sin and make sacrifices. The descendants of Eli are now wiped out, all but one, the high priest Eli. Saul cannot seek the Lord because they're the only remaining priest alive has fled, and he's gone to be with David. He has no one to intercede for him. In verse 20, one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled to David. And Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the priests of the Lord. And David said to Abiathar, I knew on the day that when Doeg the Edomite was there that he would surely tell Saul, I have occasioned the death of all the persons of your father's house. Stay with me and do not be afraid, for he who seeks my life seeks your life, and with me you shall be in safekeeping. In God's sovereignty, Saul's action has driven the last living descendant of Ahimelech to David. And by fleeing to David, he became David's high priest. He carried with him the ephod. And this very ephod is the one which contains the Urim and the Thummim, which the priest used to inquire and find out the will of God. So David now has his own priest to seek the will of God over difficult decisions. He has been drawn even nearer to the Lord, able to seek him daily and to ask for God's guidance and help. In chapter 23, they told David, behold, the Philistines are fighting at Keilah and are robbing the threshing floors. Therefore David inquired of the Lord, shall I go down? I can hear him going to the priest. He inquired of the Lord, shall I go down or not? And the answer came back, go, attack the Philistines and save Keilah. But David's men said to him, behold, we are afraid here in Judah. How much even more if we go to Keilah against the armies of the Philistines? They're not that many. There's only 400 at last count. Then David inquired again of the Lord, is that really God's will? And the Lord answered him, arise, go down to Keilah, for I will give the Philistines into your hand. And David and his men went down to Keilah and fought with the Philistines and brought away their livestock and struck them with a great blow. So David saved the inhabitants of Keilah. Even in refuge, as a refuge, David is still being used by God as a savior for the cities of Israel from their enemies. And Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, had fled to David. He had brought this ephod down there. Now it was told Saul that David had come to Keilah, and Saul said, I can hear that too, aha, God has given him into my hand, for he has shut himself in by entering into a town that has gates and bars. He plans to go down and surround them. And Saul summoned all the people to war. I mean, he's called out the whole army, to go down to Keilah and to besiege David and his men. And David knew that Saul was plotting harm against him, and he said to the Abiathar the priest, bring the ephod here. Then David said, O Lord God of Israel, your servant has surely heard that Saul seeks to come to Keilah, so to destroy the city on my account. Will the men of Keilah surrender me into his hands? Well, can I stay here? Will I be safe? Will Saul come down as your servant has heard? He surely heard when Saul mustered the armies of Israel. O Lord, God of Israel, please tell your servant. And the Lord said, he will come down. And then David said, will the men of Keilah surrender me into the hand of Saul? And the Lord said, they will surrender you. And then David and his men were now they're up to 600, arose and departed from Keilah, and they went wherever they could go. When Saul was told that David had escaped Keilah, he gave up his expedition and David remained in the strongholds in the wilderness, in the hill country, and the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul sought him every day, but God did not give him into his hand. The next chapters of the book tell about this pursuit of David. So from this, I would like us to see how the Lord has continued to be with David in all his troubles. He continued to draw men to him. He added to the small number of men until they are now more than 600. Significant fighting force. It's not large, but it's big enough to have a powerful impact if they're well commanded. Saul comes out to them in force and tries to trap them in some city, but out in the open, in a well-fortified location, they will be very hard to defeat. He has given him the means of seeking the will of God and guidance of the Lord. And that is extremely special because now he can find out where the safe places are to flee to. The Lord has made him near to David and is revealing himself to him, helping him through all his troubles, as David has written in the psalm. He learns to trust and call out to the Lord wherever he goes. It's a great growth in David's personal relationship with Yahweh. He's more than just his God. He is his help in times of need and in great tribulations that he's experiencing. So here are my conclusions for this morning. The Lord has compassion on the destitute and afflicted. He hears their prayers, and he forgives their sins of those who repent and call out to him, and he rescues them in the times of trouble. David fled from Saul, but the Lord gave him companions and protection from all his enemies. It's always easier to go through hard times if you have someone to stand together with. God's purpose continues to be established for David. Saul's fears only drive Saul further and farther away from the Lord and isolate him from the Lord and from his own family. In times of trouble, we need to seek the Lord and let his word be a light and a guide to our lives. We have a great advantage of David in that we have the written copy of the Bible ourselves. We can always sit down and read it and seek out guidance and seek the Lord through our relationship of reading his word. And through it, he speaks to us, continues to speak to us today.